and stand in solidarity with all of those fights going on. So this is the big evening, the big debate between Generation Liberty and Socialist Alternative. And tonight we're going to be debating the question, is capitalism better than socialism? This is the question that has been going around for a long time, has been being reignited over the last couple of years. And we're going to have a pretty good evening tonight of we're going to have speakers from the side arguing for socialism and a side arguing for capitalism. I'm one of the moderators, and we've also got Gideon, who's going to be introducing the first speaker for Generation Liberty.
Thank you so much, Annika. It's great to be here again with the Socialist Alternative. I myself was at Melbourne Uni also. It's great to see so many people from Socialist Alternative come out and watch this debate. I'm pretty sure I remember you from my uni days, but nevertheless, thank you for participating in this to everybody. Whatever our differences are, we all believe in some change of some form. We all believe in doing the best for our country and for the wider world. And, you know, too often these debates don't actually happen at all. And it's great that we can ventilate our ideas and engage in good faith debate. I acknowledge that I'm coming at you from the state of Victoria, and we stand in solidarity with every single Victorian who is under house arrest right now or is economically deprived or indeed being plunged into mental health issues because of Dan Andrews and his unscientific and cruel and wrong lockdown. So a quick plug for Generation Liberty. This has been brought to you by the Institute of Public Affairs and our youth movement, Gen Lib. Please go to ipa.org.au where you can join Gen Lib for $10 and receive all manner of merchandise, books, and plenty of other things to give you the intellectual fuel to go out and participate in the battle of ideas. But with that, I would like to hand over to our first speaker, Luca Rossi. Luca is a law student from Monash University, a campus coordinator for Generation Liberty at that university, and is the star of such IPA videos as What I Wasn't Told About Climate Change, What I Wasn't Told About Donald Trump, and our upcoming title, What I Wasn't Told About Socialism, which tonight he'll give you a sneak preview about the contents of that video, I'm sure. So over to you, Luca Rossi.
Thanks very much for that, Gideon. Socialism in general has a record of failure so blatant that only an intellectual and the socialist alternative, it seems, could ignore or evade it. Ladies and gentlemen, socialism has failed and continues to fail time and time again. Yet there are those who still seek to implement it. Not only this, they seek to replace a system that has beyond proven its worth. This system is capitalism. Capitalism is an economic system that revolves around private ownership of property and the means of production and free exchange. Socialism, by contrast, calls for the centralization of all resources to a single government or body in order to achieve total equity, with state control of the means of production and no private ownership. Let's be clear here. This debate cannot be won by merely pointing out the flaws in the other system. The affirmative will show that not only is socialism highly flawed, but capitalism is itself a superior economic system. Likewise, it falls on the negative to prove the merits of socialism, rather than to point to every problem in society and blame them on capitalism or to call us inbreds. Hence, I will first discuss the functionality of capitalism in practice and the ways in which it facilitates progress, creativity, and human flourishing. Our second speaker will then argue that capitalism is a fundamentally moral system. First, let's look at what capitalism has done for the poor. According to the World Bank, the global rate of extreme poverty, or number of people living on less than $1.90 per day, more than halved between 1990 and 2010. To clarify, that is a decrease from 1.85 billion people to 767 million, a drop in over a billion people. Life expectancy has increased from 52.5 years to 71.6 between 1960 and 2015. Manufacturing wages have gone from $3.40 to $12.50, and the average income of the lowest quintile of the population has increased by $7,600 just since the year 2000. Yes, the rich have gotten richer, but the poor have gotten richer too. Compare this to socialism. which is single-handedly responsible for the deaths of over 100 million people in the 20th century alone through starvation and genocide. In order to understand how this has happened, let us first look at the way capitalism functions. It works on a rather simple idea: supply and demand. Economics 101. Simply, a product, to minimize wastage, should be produced at a rate similar to or the same as the demand. Yet in a chain of production, this line of supply and demand becomes immeasurably long and convoluted, spanning continents, cultures, and time. The only way this gargantuan chain of production can work is through the price mechanism. Prices at each step of the production process signal what resources should be invested where by determining relative value. Fundamentally, the people, by buying specific goods and services, determine these prices, demanding better services or lower prices by buying alternatives developed in a competitive market. We decide what we want, and the market bends to our will. This poses a huge problem for socialism, as no central planner can ever know what it is we want, how much of it, and whether or not to invest time and resources into it, let alone be expected to single-handedly decipher the huge chain of production required to produce, well, anything. There is no signaling process. That is, until you see people queuing up at the only shop with any bread left, or hospitals running dry of basic medicine. Case in point, in Venezuela, we see the failure of central planning, where Chavez's policies of nationalizing industry and fixing prices have failed spectacularly. Supermarkets routinely run out of food, the healthcare system has collapsed, and crime has spiraled out of control, with US aid continuing to bolster what's left of the health of its citizens. In the Soviet Union, it took 4 times as many resources to make a car as it did in Japan after World War II. Yes, a country that was nuked twice was still more efficient. A central planning government leaves people starving, malnourished, and routinely waste resources because of the lack of signaling at each stage of a complex supply chain. So I asked the opposition to kindly explain to us how exactly they would surmount this problem, such that they do not fall prey to the issues of inefficiency, scarcity, and starvation that have plagued all other attempts at socialism. I won't hold my breath. Now, because of capitalism's functionality, it is more than a mere economic system. It is a driving force for creativity and innovation. This relies on the fundamental principle at the heart of all capitalism. Do what the people want. The profit might be a motive, but the outcome is a fundamental good for society. If you produce something subpar or provide a subpar service, you just won't get the business. As a result, we now have technologies that people could not have even conceived of less than a century ago. Salted meat, or as we Italians call it, prosciutto, has gone from a necessity to a commodity thanks to fridges. While there may have been one radio per household at the turn of the century, TV ownership is now at 99%. Entrepreneurs and innovators are spurred on to create better products purely because we might be willing to buy them. This is also where the socialist analysis of capitalism fails. The socialist view of economics is rather simple. There is a limited pie, and if you take a piece of that pie, then you must have taken it from someone else. As in Dark Side of the Moon, don't take a slice of my pie. But as Reverend Dr. Kenneth Barnes aptly postulates, wealth is not matter. It can be both created and destroyed. However, wealth is the delta between the amount of labor and resources required for subsistence and everything else beyond subsistence. And that everything else is what makes human beings flourish. So how do we get that delta? Simple answer: technology and innovation. Hence, theoretically, wealth is only limited by our drive to continue innovating, and thus the limited pie becomes effectively limitless. By contrast, socialism is hampered by its own idea that there is only a small pie, thereby through its redistributive policies, destroying innovation, limiting wealth, and keeping all people poor, starving, and unable to create. Under socialism, we would be stuck at the lowest rung of the hierarchy of need, a survivalist hellscape antithetical to any form of progression. But hey, at least we're equal. Speaking of innovation, the socialist system not only lacks the profit motive for innovation, but actively stifles it through heavy-handed regulation, ultimately ruining the economy. A prime example of this is India, which until the late 90s had a highly regulated economy, including high import and export tariffs that went up to 350%. Its share of world trade between 1950 and 1993, due to its brand of economic socialism, as they called it, went from 2.4% to just 0.5%, owing to the highly regulated, over-bureaucratized system which severely inhibited competition, innovation, efficiency, and economic growth. This lack of competition and innovation also created a highly unequal economic distribution, allowing for big companies to monopolize an uncompetitive and stagnant market strangled by over-regulation. But in 1991, after the collapse of the USSR, India moved to open and deregulate its economy. Their, quote, step-by-step reforms had huge effects. In just 2 years between 1991 and 1993, their deficit went from 3.3% to 1.8% of their GDP, which then halved to just 0.6% by 1995. It also has a growing middle class as a result of the poor becoming richer, with more potential for growth as people living rurally move to the cities. So what can we learn from this? First, that socialism can only be saved by the free market. This is not the only example of a socialist country turning around because of them embracing capitalism. Socialism is not the remedy to capitalism. Capitalism is the remedy to socialism. Second, that regulation of the economy creates the very things that socialism characterizes as inherent to capitalism: inequality and monopolies. It is only through the stifling of the competitive free market by big socialist government that such things can thrive. To be clear, socialists cannot purport to not advocate regulatory big government. In fact, their system depends on it. It requires a big government to redistribute the wealth in the first place. Further, under capitalism, anyone can go and live in their own commune, as capitalism is predicated on freedom. But socialism requires the banning of public ownership and a big government to enforce their ideals on all people, which can only be achieved through violent revolution and enforcement. To conclude, it is clear that capitalism is far better than socialism. Capitalism is functional, innovative, and free, while socialism is dysfunctional, restrictive, and has an abundance, unlike food, of wastage, suffering, and death. To finish, I'd like to leave you with some words from esteemed economist Milton Friedman. A society that puts equality before freedom will get neither, but a society that puts freedom before equality will get a high degree of both. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that obviously very well researched and scintillating talk. So as Gideon said, the opposition is, sorry, as Gideon said, the opposition is Generation Liberty, but we are from Socialist Alternative, and Socialist Alternative is the largest socialist group with campus clubs all around the country. We are involved in countless movements, demonstrations, campaigns for refugee rights, against the destructive attacks on the climate, against racism, and fighting against all forms of oppression in society. And after this live stream is concluded, Socialist Alternative is going to be hosting state-based Zoom discussions for all lefties who want to connect with other lefties and talk about how, you know, the arguments put forward here tonight don't actually hold up in the face of reality. So our first speaker for the negative side, arguing against the idea that capitalism is better than socialism, is Priya Day. Priya is a student organiser at the University of Queensland, a counsellor as well at the Student Union at UQ. She's been involved in countless campaigns from fighting against the government's attacks on education and most recently been involved in the campaign to free the refugees held at Kangaroo Point. So Priya, welcome, and let's hear what you have to say.
Okay, well, I might start by saying that the nauseating gobbledygook that I just heard did not disprove that supporters of the IPA are inbred. Capitalism is a system of mass exploitation that is held up by brutality and that is actually designed to break. The system beloved by my opponents is a fantasy world. It's a complete invention. So today I'm not going to talk about fairy tales. I'm going to talk about material reality. And so first, I'd like to start with 2 points of rebuttal to whatever that guy's name, what he just said. So the first point being that capitalism has lifted people out of poverty. So the first thing to say is that capitalism is a contradictory system. It produces at the same time enormous wealth as at the same time enormous depravity. So has capitalism lifted people out of poverty? It's true that there are less people living in absolute poverty today than there were 30 or 40 years ago. However, I'd ask the IPA to look at where those people being lifted out of poverty came from and by what means. The majority of people lifted out of poverty has occurred in the authoritarian dictatorship that is China. So I don't know if the opposition supports those particular means of economic development, but in Socialist Alternative, we certainly don't. But what is undeniable is that there are still 1 billion people around the world at risk of starvation. In a highly developed country like Australia, 13% of people live in poverty. And this need not be the case. There are resources for every single person in the world to be obese, resources for every single person in the world to have a house. No one need go without. The reason any deprivation exists at all is that we live in a society of class and profit where people are not allowed to have the things they need unless they can pay for it. A second point is about the tried and true trope of the IPA of raising that Venezuela is an example of the failure of socialism. Now, I am a Trotskyist. I am a revolutionary socialist. Venezuela was never socialist. Venezuela is an example that if you actually want to destroy capitalism, you need a revolution that gets rid of the state, because any means, any attempt to change the system from within will be crushed. It is totally disgusting and disingenuous, actually, for supporters of capitalism to say that the deprivation in Venezuela, which is real, the lack of medicine, the lack of food, is a result of socialist economic organization. If socialism will fail so bloody naturally, why does the United States try and crush every democratic regime that has challenged, that has tried to nationalize oil, that has tried to challenge United States imperialism? Why does the United States, it's bullshit to say the United States provides aid to Venezuela. They have sanctions on Venezuela. They're starving an entire population. So if socialism is so designed to fail, why do capitalist and imperialist countries try so hard to crush regimes that are leftist? So yes, anyway, that was highly unconvincing from the first speaker. So to make some, I think first, if you're going to understand why we need a socialist alternative, you need to understand how capitalism works. It just takes total deception to paint capitalism as a system of flourishing creativity and egalitarianism. The main way that workers and the poor are taught that class is evil and profit comes first is through what they actually experience in the system, which is why it's actually embarrassing that anyone would defend capitalism in 2020, given the year that we have all experienced. So coronavirus has shown that capitalism is incapable of achieving what should be the basic ambition of a functioning society, which is to keep people alive. Workers and bosses do not have an equal right to life in capitalism. So where Donald Trump catches COVID and unfortunately did not die, he gets airlifted to a private hospital which has the facilities of a 5-star hotel, whereas working class people have died in under-resourced and overflowing public hospitals. Nurses in these hospitals have had to play God day in, day out for the last 10 months, and or else working class people have died in their beds knowing that they will not be able to afford the medical fees if they even make it through the waiting lines at the hospitals. So I don't know if people caught the quip from the chair of the IPA opposing the lockdown in Victoria. This is a representative of the big business interests, people like those behind the Unlock Hospitality campaign in Victoria, who would rather, they are virulently barracking to reopen non-essential businesses because, as has always been the case in capitalism, the rich would rather workers die than profits be hampered. And profit the ruling class has during the period of the pandemic. In the United States, just this year, while 40 million Americans have filed for unemployment, the wealthy have added $637 billion to their wealth. So whether or not that figure makes your stomach churn basically reveals which side you're on. But putting life before profit before human life, as has been shown during the pandemic, on an enormous scale, putting profit before human life on an enormous scale is nothing new in capitalism. And actually, another key issue of 2020, the climate crisis, is an obscene example that a rising tide does not lift all boats. The Institute of Public Affairs denies, probably are some of the only people left in the entire world who continue to deny the existence of the climate crisis, publishing article after article, denouncing the Bureau of Meteorology for cooking the books that climate change is a hoax. Well, this is because they support profits. Fossil fuels and plastics are immensely profitable, and that's why they continue to be produced. That is the simple irrationality of capitalism. But you don't have to be a scientist to see that people's lives are being put at risk from the climate emergency. Right now, as fires continue to rage in one part of California, on another, on Chesapeake County, residents are watching water literally lap at the doors of their home as sea levels continue their horror rise. So you just need to, have your eyes open to see the reality of the climate crisis putting people's lives at risk. Now, a competitive marketplace and private ownership of the means of production has not innovated a way out of the climate disaster. It is actually precisely competition and privatization which have been a barrier to the innovation that is desperately required to reorganize all of production, agriculture, cities, the basic ways that people live in order to have a sustainable economy. And again, it's not difficult to understand why that is. The fossil fuel barons, the tech giants, and their political servants in government, what do they care about, working class people dying in fires or, poor people in Bangladesh drowning in typhoons? They are actually a barrier to the kind of innovation needed because for the moment, they're making enormous profits from fossil fuels that are destroying the planet. And that is as simple as it is. The profit first, short-term interests, nature of capitalism produces enormous destruction and irrationality like the climate crisis, which is like being on a train and watching it hurtle over the edge of a cliff. And 2020, above all else, I think has proven something that Marx argued 150 years ago, before the first millionaire came into existence, before the First World War, before the first nuclear bomb was even thought of, which is that the crises of capitalism force working class people into resistance, because when things go wrong in capitalism, it is working class people who are forced to pay the price. So it is working class people this year who have been forced to choose between profit and health. It is working class people who have faced the flames of climate destruction. And it is working class people who did not cause this current global economic crisis, but who are facing, mass sackings, mass wage cuts, and mass evictions. And so I think this is the key point. If capitalism is so fucking wonderful, then why do people resist again and again and again? Why have we seen Black Lives Matter in the United States, the struggles for democracy in Belarus and Hong Kong, and mass strikes in Iran and Indonesia, and just in the last 2 days, tens of thousands of people taking to the streets in Thailand and in Nigeria? And in Socialist Alternative, we pledge our solidarity with all of these people fighting for their lives. And these people are actually struggling for the very things that the IPA professes that capitalism provides. They're struggling for freedom, the freedom not to get killed by the police, the freedom to get medical attention when sick, the freedom not to starve. These are struggles demanding that working people should have more choices in their lives, the choice to choose a political leader, the choice to have an adequate place to live, the choice to have time for leisure. And it's these struggles, again, more than anything else, which prove the revolutionary socialist case against capitalism. This system degrades the lives of billions, it forces workers into resistance, and the second workers stand up and fight back, the rulers of this system shuck and tear asunder every little bit of ideology about democracy and freedom and egalitarianism and giving a fuck about the majority. They respond with repression, and it reveals the system for what it is, naked class war. So from the vantage point of 2020, it is, crystal clear that, if you have an ounce of, humanism in you, if you have an ounce of collective consciousness, you have to oppose the capitalist system. But also from the vantage point of 2020, it seems pretty fucking clear that the days of capitalism are numbered.
G'day. Okay. Well, thank you so much for that impassioned presentation. Can I just remind participants about the tenor of this debate? I don't think we need racist microaggressions like calling Luca, our first speaker, whatever that guy's name was. That's dead naming of a proud, culturally and linguistically diverse Australian. So we should, not have microaggressions and othering of our fellow Australians in that way. On that note, I would like to hand over to another proud, culturally and linguistically diverse Australian, Phumika Dissanayake. Phumika is a student at Monash University as well, and also happens to be both a state debating champion and a state public speaking champion. So Phumika, over to you.
Thanks so much for that, Gideon. And I must say, I can't really hear anything at the moment. Mrs. Dar has really burst my eardrums. I'm not really sure that I can continue with this debate, to be honest, but I'll keep on going. Audience, the socialists cannot win this debate by saying how bad capitalism is, but by proving that their magical fairy dreamland socialism is any better. Now, we've already told you that functionally socialism is a nightmare, but everyone knows that. What we cannot concede as well is that socialism is any better than capitalism theoretically either. Because morally too, socialism is repugnant. And for my substantive today, I will base this characterization along the 4 lines through which doctors, the medical student, are taught to ethically deal with patients. In this case, our patient will be society, and the doctor will be the respective social structure. And we'll base our ethical analysis along those 4 key virtues of autonomy, justice, beneficence, and non-maleficence. And through these virtues, I will directly respond to the arguments raised by the first speaker of the opposition and present our moral case. Initially, let's talk about autonomy, or the ability for humans to have a say in their own lives without fear or coercion. Already we see a problem for the socialists with this, don't we? Because socialism is inherently coercive and restrictive of the individual. When a system is contingent on there being an excessively centralized means of production, it's a breeding ground for tyranny. And they may say that the tyranny we've seen in the past, like in Venezuela, is not real socialism. So you can't make a moral claim on that kind of precedent. Note that although this just isn't true, even attempting to reach some kind of socialism has completely destroyed countries and people. I'm sure the end goal of the Soviet Union was socialism, as I'm sure the end goal of Venezuela was socialism, a thriving socialist society, as they like to call it. To make matters worse for the opposition's case, socialists, they base their ideals on overabundance, extreme wealth. And they would say that in such a world, when the socialist revolution does take place, because there is an excess, there won't be such tyranny. This is on all the socialist platforms at the moment. They argue that tyranny won't exist because there's an excess. But how do we arrive at that excess? Surprise, surprise, capitalism is the answer. The socialists can't just piggyback off of everything that capitalism has created and claim that their socialism would exist in some kind of unrealistic, self-perpetuating economy and then go and say socialism is better. All of the supposed good of your socialist system is from capitalism. thanks to capitalism, because of capitalism. The opposition is acting like an ungrateful child, to be honest. But regardless of what your real socialism is, it should not justify at the moral level the claim, I'll steal from you because I want to. It's one of the most selfish philosophies out there. And it rests on the notion that just by breathing, I deserve everything. It's forceful in its nature. Capitalism is consensual. You have something of worth, I'll give you back something of worth. In this sense, capitalism is an economic democracy, and socialism is an economic dictatorship of the elite. On the topic of dictatorship, let's now move on to which system is more just or fair. And the major moral conflict between socialists and capitalists is that one word, inequality. And I was just quite weird because the opposition and the first speaker in particular talked about the divisions of inequality and the working class, and then also went on to say that, yes, she admits that capitalism lifts people out of poverty and has lifted people out of poverty, and then said nothing of substance after that, because she admits that capitalism has lifted people out of poverty. In particular, they always present this myth that the top 1% or a certain number of people has as much wealth as the bottom 60 or 70%. It changes depending on which debate you watch. It almost makes it sound like absolute BS. Now, the fact of the matter is that these stats are false. It's a myth because it fails to account for debt. Under their system, you who may have a university debt here in Australia would be poorer than a farmer in China who has no debt. And that doesn't seem to be quite right. In spite of these questionable statistics by the opposition, even if we take them at face value, they fail to understand that inequality and the supposed classes that it formed is not philosophically or inherently immoral. Inequality is necessary for drive, for progression, and unlike in socialism, in a capitalist society, you satisfy your own ambition and ego in the service of your fellow citizens. In fact, historical records would show that it was precisely the lower classes who benefited the most from the economic progress unleashed due to capitalism. And sure, the so-called captains of industry personally became quite rich, but the rise of big business primarily benefited the working class. After all, the titans of industry engaged in mass production in order to sell products to the masses. Here's where we arrive at Jeff Bezos, the radical left's punching bag and source of jealousy and outrage, which Socialist Alternative promoted to death before this event. The socialists claim, how is it just that he's worth so much? He doesn't deserve that wealth. A factory worker deserves just as much. And if you think about it, him and his billionaire friends, if they pulled their money together, they could solve world hunger. My goodness, not only has that wealth income conflation fallacy committed the opposition's argument to intellectual economic suicide, but what the opposition continue to fail to understand is that the economy is not based off of labor, but off of value. Think back to what Luca said about supply and demand. Bezos has, on one hand, provided the facilities and infrastructure to make wealth accumulation easier for those workers who otherwise would not even dream about achieving that same output. But on the other hand, and more importantly, he has provided a service that makes access to consumer products substantially affordable for those of lower income. That's value. That's real societal value. The entire system is why the lower classes have seen drastic improvements in wealth. It's why the lower classes of today would have been the kings of yesterday. Now let's talk about beneficence, or in other words, which system does more net good to people. And we could take this on both the individual and global level. Now, the opposition have tried to label capitalism as an oppressive and discriminatory system, which doesn't provide any goodness. Give me a break. How is it a system that's only marked as the dollar being so discriminatory of the other features? It's illogical. And I'd like to remind you that in capitalism, trade and industry are controlled by private owners rather than by the state. The vast majority of the problems in our society that the opposition is talking about when it comes to oppression and fairness, such as the downfalls of the COVID situation at the moment, is not actually tied to the capitalist system, but government intervention. In fact, if we examine the COVID situation and the government and the economic responses to it, we see that capitalism is actually the answer to the COVID situation. Why? Because we see that what's actually affected the system in place at the moment is lockdowns, because lockdowns have hindered capitalism from thriving, right? It's stopped businesses from actually being able to do what they do. And not also that the response that we have is that the response that the opposition has is that in order to facilitate a proper response to the COVID-19 pandemic, we need to have a wealthy economy which has the ability and the infrastructure to be able to facilitate a recovery to that. We had the plague, for goodness sake, in Europe. Do you think we would have been able to respond to that better if it weren't for the progresses made by capitalism? And where is our optimism placed now in the COVID situation? A vaccine, a collaboration between our hallowed universities that socialists want to dismantle and the private sector who will produce and distribute that vaccine. As a medical student, I understand the problems of the pharmaceutical industry, but my God, has it done a lot of good. As Luca mentioned, capitalism, on the other hand, is inherently good, allowing for wealth accumulation, human creativity, and flourishing. But how about global goodness? Surely capitalism can't be better in that regard, say for something like the environment. Well, global goodness is another area which capitalism thrives and socialism fails to deliver. And for the environment, the reasoning is twofold. Firstly, it is precisely thanks to the immense wealth that capitalism provides that the environment can be looked after better. Think more efficient transport solutions, cleaner energy, and innovative technology created and driven by the profit incentive. Secondly, owing to the driving forces behind capitalism, processes and services will be much more efficient than socialism. In other words, fewer resources will be required for the same output. We've seen this in Soviet Russia, where the amount of energy and resources required to produce an ounce of steel was double that in the United States. It's precisely thanks to capitalism that we have the answer to these solutions. And before I wrap up these points, let's not confuse democratic social policy with the efficacy of a means of production system to respond to environmental concerns. That varies depending on which government is in power at any given time. What doesn't is the immense good that capitalism does provide, irrespective of social policy. Now, I've been talking about beneficence, but on the flip side, there is the next virtue of non-maleficence. And the opposition has talked about wars before, and they say that only socialism can stop imperialist wars. Unsurprisingly, this is also not true. In a free market economy where your neighbors are your trade partners, you have an impetus to protect them and your relationship to them. In a purely capitalist world, bilateral negotiation is key to ensuring one's own protection. But don't let us distract you from the fact about how violent these socialists want to be. They want to create a forceful and violent uprising, destroy our institutions with minimal regard for human life, and rashly prop up the socialist system while silencing dissidents. For them, their means justify the ends, and those means are insanity. It's the definition of immoral and is revealing of how truly radical and out of touch the socialist alternative are. I realize I've come to the end of my time, but I'd like to wrap up with two small concessions for socialism. Socialism does work, but it only works in two places. Heaven, where they already have it, and hell, where they already have it as well. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for those witty remarks at the end. I think they really capped off the speech. I think our audience in the live stream is welcome to also put forward their opinions of the speeches as well. So we're coming to one of our final sort of first parts of the discussion. So we've just had an affirmative, negative, and another affirmative, and we're going to go to our last negative, which is going to be Luca Tavan. And after that, our speakers are going to get a chance to do a rebuttal. But we also want to have a chance for some questions as well. So there's in the live stream, people can maybe put some questions if they'd like, and maybe our speakers can respond to those as well. Speaking of the live stream, if you want to be part of a discussion afterwards and you're a socialist and you want to talk to other socialists, you can join a Socialist Alternative Zoom. There's one for each city, and I'm sure the Zoom links for that will be posted in the chat or on the Socialist Alternative Facebook page. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Okay, so we're going to move on to our speaker now, Luca Tavan. Luca is a socialist at Melbourne University. He's been involved in the campaigns not to dismantle universities, but actually to defend them from the Liberal government's attacks. They currently just raised the cost of humanities degrees, cut funding, and also are going to take away supports for students who fail their classes, which I think is a pretty unfree thing to do. So Luca is also a frequent contributor to Socialist Alternative's newspaper, Red Flag, which you can subscribe to as well. All of those details on the Red Flag website. So Luca, your turn to take the floor. And yeah, I hope you can respond to the arguments from our opposition.
Cool, thanks Annika. That was a wild ride. I think all those long afternoons spent practicing your debating skills in the mirror clearly paid off because it was incredibly entertaining. I think it's pretty remarkable to sit here and listen to a couple of people spend 10 minutes each defending the idea that capitalism is a system that's based on rising living standards and flourishing human freedom in the year 2020 without them turning beet red. Firstly, on the question of raising living standards, I could tell from the comments of the first speaker that you guys don't really read the news very much because that Hugo Chavez that you talked about as wreaking havoc in the Venezuelan economy has been dead for 7 years. But you might not have noticed in 2020, capitalism is going through the biggest economic contraction in its history, which is plunging millions of people into poverty, often for the first time. You might have seen the scenes in the United States of lines and lines of people in their cars trying to get access to food banks and charity, or the reports from the World Bank that have said that even the most extreme levels of poverty, that's people on less than $1.90 a day, the number of people in that level of extreme poverty is set to rise by millions this year. So that's capitalism and its rising living standards. The idea of capitalism as a system based on, I think the last speaker put it, consensual relations and human freedom is a fantasy as well. If you look at the world that we're living in today, it's one that's characterized more and more by border walls, barbed wire fences, prisons, and militarized police. So I wanted to talk a little bit firstly about why capitalism is a system that's actually based on constant state violence and why people who defend the system and pretend to be libertarian or against big government are complete hypocrites. So you could do this in a number of ways. You could do it with a history lesson, so talking about how capitalism came into the world based on massive state violence, whether that was the genocide that was committed through colonization here in Australia to set up capitalist social relations, or the transatlantic slave trade, which was the thing that fueled the Industrial Revolution in Britain. But I think you can do it a lot more easily just by looking around, the world that we live in today. So you look at Standing Rock in North Dakota. So when First Nations protesters and their supporters stood up there against an oil pipeline that was being planned to run through their land, what did the oil barons who wanted to build that pipeline do? Did they call these two boy geniuses that we debated against to come down and extol the virtues of the free market to the protesters? No, they didn't do that, actually. They sent in militarized police and the National Guard in their hundreds to brutalize those protesters and pave the way for business to resume. In Chile over the summer, when protesters stood up against a user-pays transport system, the government permanently debilitated 2,000 of them with rubber bullets, blinding hundreds and hundreds of people who were protesting. In Indonesia last week, we saw a wave of protests and strikes of 2 million workers against a new set of bills that aim to do things like abolish the minimum wage and pave the way for deforestation and massive environmental destruction. And the cops again were sent in and arrested hundreds and hundreds of people. If you think about these things, building fossil fuel pipelines, user-paid services, abolishing the minimum wage, these are all actually IPA policies. These are the policies advocated for by the people that we're speaking against today. And every time those sorts of priorities are pushed, people stand up against it. And the capitalist class, in order to make profits and run their supposedly free economic system, they have to rely on massive levels of state violence to pursue their aims. And you don't just have to take my word for it. You can just look at the sorts of people that the IPR holds as their heroes to see what authoritarians they are. Margaret Thatcher, who was featured in the promotional video that Generation Liberty made for this event, certainly was very good at talking about, the virtues of small government when she was slashing welfare and driving workers in Britain into poverty, but was very much an advocate of big government when it meant sending troops in on miners who were striking to defend their right to unionise. Robert Menzies, who was a Liberal Prime Minister and the kind of patron saint of the IPA, a big supporter back in the day, was a sympathiser of Hitler. He went to Germany in the late 1930s and said it was a great experience because in Germany they'd erected Hitler as a sort of religious figure at the head of the state. So anyone who defends capitalism as an economic system, a system that's based on vast inequality and exploitation, also defends massive state violence and coercion, which is required to uphold that system. Thought it would be useful to talk about the argument that the market is the most rational way economically to allocate resources and solve social problems as well, though. Because the pandemic that we're living through right now, I think has to be seen as a case of the failure of the market. There's an immunologist, Peter Doherty, who won a Nobel laureate, who said that the reason that we don't have the kind of preparation to produce a vaccine for COVID is because of the failure of the market. We could have made a head start on this years and years and years ago after SARS struck, but all the research to develop a vaccine for SARS was abandoned pretty much immediately after the disease subsided because there was no profit to be made in researching it. And I think that's just one, tip of the iceberg of the kind of irrationality of the capitalist market. Today, we live in a world where every single form of scarcity that exists is an expression of the irrationality of the market. So the fact that the mass malnutrition still exists in the world, every year 3.5 million children die before the age of 5 because they can't get access to food. That's not a real shortage that exists in terms of resources. That's an artificial scarcity that's imposed by the market. Across the world, there's enough food produced every year to feed 1.5 times the world's population. But the vast majority of it, that excess food, is thrown into the oceans or burnt because the stock needs to be destroyed to artificially inflate prices and maintain profitability. Or you can look at housing. Here where I live in Melbourne, there are 2 unoccupied homes for every homeless person living in the CBD right now. Those 2 things can't be put together by the capitalist market because those things are only produced to realise a profit. Nothing is produced under the system to meet human need. I think the idea that capitalism is a system that's based on real innovation is a bit of a myth as well. If you look at the climate crisis, for instance, there's no shortage of technological solutions to the problems we face, but we have a reality where the IPCC says that if we don't dramatically transform our economy in the next 12 years, we're going to face the destruction of the planet. The technology for solar panels, for instance, has actually existed in its basic form since the 1830s. That's been around forever and could have been developed and utilised generations ago. The problem was that it was always more profitable and efficient from the standpoint of the capitalist class to exploit fossil fuels, which were just readily available under the ground. So none of those technologies were developed and utilised, and now we face an existential threat, which could end up killing off all life on this planet. One thing I thought kind of needed to be addressed here that speakers from the opposing side don't understand is an argument that actually I think most people who just live in the world grasp pretty fundamentally. And it's the argument that capitalism is a system that's based on the exploitation of labour, rather than a system where supposed wealth creation that the previous speakers attributed to billionaires is a rising tide that lifts all boats. I think that the reason that the 2 speakers opposite, don't understand that, probably not because they're stupid. I'm sure you guys got really good marks in school or whatever. But it's because if your future career depends on you not understanding something, it's pretty hard to drum it into your heads. But it's a pretty basic reality that the tiny minority who are rich, the layer of billionaires who control the vast majority of the world's resources, have that wealth on the basis of suppressing the living standards of the vast majority of people. So yeah, Jeff Bezos is actually a pretty good example of that. Someone who has a fortune of $200 billion. He makes at the moment roughly about $1,200 per second, about $4.5 million an hour, give or take. This is, he can make the median wage of one of his employees in about a minute. So how does Jeff Bezos create this wealth? Is it from his great ideas? Well, the great idea really that Jeff Bezos he had 20 years ago, which was, how about we sell books on the internet? Which is, I think not the greatest brainwave in history. It's pretty obvious, really. So where does all that wealth come from? Well, the profits that Jeff Bezos derives that allows him to make $1,200 per second come from the fact that he exploits the labour of an incredible network of workers all across the globe. So Amazon has about 175 of what they call fulfillment centres across the world. In the United States alone, they employ about 1 million people. And how much profit and wealth Jeff Bezos and the other shareholders of Amazon can accrue is determined by how much work they can get out of these people and how cheaply. So you think about the working conditions that drives people towards. Workers at Amazon are forced to urinate in bottles because it's not profitable to allow them to have breaks to go to the bathroom. Multiple women have been forced to miscarry because they've been made to work carrying heavy loads through pregnancy. And they're paid so low that Amazon in many states in the United States is the biggest employer of workers that have to receive food stamps. So that's federal subsidies to be able to buy enough food to survive. So not only that, but I think it's worth adding that in the context of the pandemic, it's just come out recently that 19,000 workers at Amazon have contracted coronavirus because they've been forced to continue to work to feed themselves rather than be subsidized by the corporation that sucked so much money out of them. So we're concerned about inequality, not just because inequality is morally repugnant, which I think it is. It's a marker of the inability of our system to allocate resources to people who actually need them, but because inequality is actually a symptom of something more fundamental that's going on in capitalism, which is that the wealth that is created by workers, the people who actually make everything run, from sending off orders at Amazon to assembling iPhones, is systematically stolen and pocketed in the form of profits, generating a society where only a tiny minority of people are seeing the product of the wealth that's created. I wanted to say a couple of things just really briefly now about what a socialist society would look like, because that's part of the argument as well, I think. Contrary to what the speakers on the opposite side have said, socialism is not just about wealth redistribution, and it's definitely not about more state control. Socialism is about saying that workers, the people that actually do all of the work in society, should have democratic control over the process of production and the whole of society. And this is not just, though, like an economic model that we hold up that we want to implement in the future, but it's a set of politics that ties the day-to-day struggles of workers against the barbaric priorities of this system to the ultimate goal of a socialist society. So every strike where workers put their interests and their lives in front of the interests of profit, every time they take over their workplaces and run them democratically and show they can do it a million times better than their bosses, is a glimpse of a socialist society, one that's not run by a tiny, tiny minority of billionaires, but by the mass of people.
Great, thank you very much, Luca, for that. So, Gideon, do you want to introduce the next part?
Yes, thank you so much, Annika. So it's time for rebuttals. So please say hello again to Luca Rossi.
Well, it seems there are two of us here. Ladies and gentlemen, the amount of absolute drivel from the opposition spewed tonight has been astonishing. Unfortunately, swearing and screaming doesn't make you right, nor does a cheer squad. I wonder how much that cost. Now, the truth is, it just took the last speaker 10 minutes. 10 minutes, I'm almost entirely sure they went over time. 10 minutes to finally get to a defense of socialism that was about one sentence long. And I still sit here waiting for that answer to my question. How are you going to run the economy? You've said all these great things about, oh, we're going to run a workers' revolution and this and that, which is inherently violent in itself, as our second speaker has said. And yet you have still not provided a sound economic policy. We have been at pains to try and explain to the opposition exactly how capitalism works. We have gone through basic economics that you learn in primary school, okay? And yet still we have not received anything back. So please, we still have rebuttals to come. I await your response eagerly. Now, I'd like to address a couple of the first speaker's points. The first thing that she argues is that it was the rise of the millionaires that basically destroyed the working class, yeah? Okay, after World War I, by the way, after World War I and the rise of capitalism. So what would you rather then? Was it great before World War I? Because I seem to recall that the whole reason Marx came up with his ideology is not because of capitalism, but because of feudalism badly grafted with industrialization. Do you want to go back to that, do you? Because it wasn't the rise of capitalism, that was feudalism, which is fundamentally based on the premise that you, the slave, can't do anything without your lord. To equivalate that to capitalism, which allows you the economic freedom, as we have seen with the multitude of people brought out of poverty, feudalism doesn't allow that, which is why terribly you had factory workers living in hammocks and in terrible conditions in factories. That was feudalism and badly grafted with industrialization, not capitalism. The other thing that the first speaker said is that she's a Trotskyist. Now, I'd like to bring up that point because Trotskyism is rather interesting. Trotskyism, part of one of the things that Trotsky said, foretold, was that the USSR would fail not because of the system itself, but because of the world not being communist as well. Now, my question is this: how do you make the rest of the world communist? The only answer we've gotten to this so far is a worldwide revolution by the working class. Yes, we know all about revolutions. In fact, we've seen those in France, we've seen those in Russia, we've seen everywhere. You know what those revolutions had heads rolling, okay? This is violence. This is oppression. What you have is the capitalist class, which has yet to be defined, being killed and slaughtered. And this eventually turned to other people. Now, what this means is that if there isn't a global working class revolution, which there won't be, then what there will have to be is war. Communists will have to wage wars in order to take over the rest of the world. So, violence. That's what socialism is predicated on. Now, I'd like to address quickly the second speaker's argument that COVID is an example of the capitalist system's failure. This is completely disingenuous. In fact, any of you who live in Melbourne would know that we're not living in lockdown because of the capitalist system. We are living in lockdown because of the government. And that is precisely what we are arguing against, that the government does not stifle the free market. We have argued for small government. And at the same time, the second speaker has also argued that capitalism does not provide private housing and that, public housing, that kind of thing, right? So what is it you want? Do you want no government? Do you want big enough government to provide resources for us? What do you want? What's the end goal? That is still the question from us. So the truth is, while the opposition has sat there and provided all of these platitudes to us, we still don't have concrete answers. So again, I won't hold my breath while I wait for the original question, how will socialism work? Thank you.
Well, Luca, thank you very much for displaying to us your primary school understanding of economics and also history. So we'll move on now to Priya, who's going to do the first rebuttal for the negative side.
All right, well, you people always accuse me of screaming. One day I'm actually going to, and you will be scared. Okay, so in terms of how would socialism work, to understand how socialism would work, you have to explain how capitalism works, which the IPA is actually incapable of. So firstly, workers produce all wealth in this system and do everything that is socially useful. Workers are the ones who power the economy. They pick all the food, they stack all the shelves, they drive all the buses, etc. So the idea of wealth creation, of capitalist, entrepreneurship or whatever is total bullshit. This has to be a starting point of a Marxist understanding of the world. I have no idea what Gina Reinhardt did today. I don't know if she's been dead for years. I don't know if she's a marionette corpse, but I do know what the bus drivers of Brisbane did today, because workers actually make the world run. The second thing to know is that bosses and workers cannot get along, because capitalism is a system of exploitation where for the bosses, workers are just a commodity like a paintbrush or a slab of concrete. If they can cheapen the costs of labor, it is a way for them to produce more profit, just as they have an incentive in cheapening the costs of their other raw materials. And so as the bosses get richer, accumulate more and more wealth, that is something that drives the two classes into struggle with each other. So class antagonism is the heart of capitalism. There is no way to have any equilibrium. The third important point about capitalism that you need to understand to figure out how socialism works is that the state and capital are completely intertwined in this system. It is garbage, the IPA's argument that the market is good and it's just government that is bad. The state and the market are completely inseparable. So Lucas talked about the beginnings of the capitalist system. Slavery was not a natural process that occurred without any coercion from the state. If the IPA is so for the freedom of the market, why do you guys not support the calls, in Black Lives Matter protests for the police to be abolished? The police are an extremely important arm of the state that move against the working class when workers try to express their freedom of organisation, either in their unions or else in street protests as well. So actually, the capitalist class, the corporations, have always relied on various, armed forces as well as government regulation to actually have their system continue to run. So it is absolutely not the case that government is the problem and actually the market is good. Actually, that world, again, is a complete fantasy one that could not exist. And so to the final point of how would socialism work, basically, eliminate that parasitic layer which puts profit before everything. The important point, as workers produce everything, I see you, Annika, as workers produce everything, we have to say that there are enough resources in the world to provide for everyone. So deprivation in this system is absolutely needless. And actually, we do not celebrate conditions of inequality. We do not think that it is right that the majority of people should go without. We know that it is a material possibility for everyone to have everything that they need, for people to have some control over their own lives and over the society that we live in. And it is what socialism would be, what workers' revolution would be, is a tweak in the way that this system already works, a tiny tweak, but a completely revolutionary one, which is instead of the bosses sitting in their offices making the decisions about what goes where and who gets what, the workers who actually perform that labor, who actually know what it's like to live in this world, they should collectively and democratically control everything. And why would workers choose for food to have chemicals poured over them while people starve? Why would workers choose for houses to go empty while people sleep on the street? It doesn't make any sense. Workers could run the world a million times better than the absolute monsters who run our society. So I will finish my rebuttal with a question for you guys. Are you guys fucking scared? Are defenders of capitalism fucking scared when you see all the protests and the resistance happening around the world? International revolution is possible because capitalism is a global system. When things go wrong in the world, it goes wrong in an international way. I can see that workers across the world are rising. I think the bosses across the world can see that workers are rising. And so if you're not scared of a challenge from below, you fucking should be.
Thank you so much, Priya, for that. And yes, I am scared. I'm terrified. Now, please welcome Pumika for his rebuttal.
Well, thank you so much for that, Gideon and Vishnupriya. I don't think we've learned our inside voices just yet, but I think we'll endeavour to get that sorted. Audience, if the socialists have made anything abundantly clear tonight, is that they would rather that we are all poorer and worse off for the sake of equality. That it's okay if the poorest among us are even poorer if we're all equally poor. The socialists have really kicked the can with their debate tonight. They only needed to prove one thing, that capitalism is not better than socialism. Yet what they've resorted to is showing how capitalism may not have delivered in certain aspects, which we acknowledge, but no, is not necessarily the fault of capitalism itself, but the government interventionism, which we agree, it should be a separate, the economy and the state. And then they went on to make broad, sweeping, shallow mission statements of a functionally and morally abhorrent brand of world order that has failed and will continue to fail into the future. They needed to juxtapose the two systems and show that their side came out on top. But on each of the key clashes today, they have failed miserably. Let me remind you of the points that Socialist Alternative have tried to tell you and make it crystal clear how we come out on top in each of them. Luca has already covered poverty and COVID situation, but I'll talk a bit about the violence and conflict element. I'll talk about the oppression and exploitation element. And I'll talk about market crashes, which is COVID related as well. And finally, the environment, which they actually cannot protect. Now, firstly, let me target the violence and conflicts element. Now, they always say that it's capitalism, which is an inherently violent and conflicting social structure. But let me just make it very clear, and let me remind everyone that they are the ones who are advocating for a malicious and destructive rebellion that would undoubtedly result in the deaths of millions of people. I mean, come on. Not only would this mean violence in merely the specific countries, but it would have to be global, because obviously, because Vishnupriya is a Trotskyist, it would have to be a global event, right? Because that's a Trotskyist socialism. And we know that this is going to be the case because we have precedent in the past. And also there's going to be violence within these countries as well to enforce socialism and make sure it keeps on going, because there are bound to be people who don't agree with the socialist system. They're going to be people who want a capitalist society or free markets or whatever. And then there has to be someone to keep them in place and force them in line. How do you achieve that? Obviously through violence. And the opposition has also talked a big deal about oppression and exploitation. Through precedent and theoretically, we understand it's actually socialism, which is the oppressive and exploitative of its citizenship, with power reserved to a small few to impart authority on the masses. And they also brought up this issue of how can we justify the poverty and hunger of other countries? Well, we find this claim quite discriminatory and quite racist in its connotations, because it implies that the relative overall wealth between certain nations is determinative of its success and progress towards higher standards of living. Note that a lot of these countries are in a transition either out of repressive dictatorships or socialist-like regimes, and it would simply be unfair to assess the mean pays of these nations or the relative wealth as a determinant of their quality of life or progress to it. Pure racism and ignorance by this opposition. And with regards to wages of employees, it's not Jeff Bezos' call on what determinants of price, what determinants of the wages of these workers are, but the overall market value. If they feel they can achieve more for their skills elsewhere, then they're free to seek those opportunities. And this is a little bit on slavery. Let me remind you that slavery existed in all societies. It was the free democratic West that ended slavery. And a little bit on market crashes as well, because they went to death with this topic of COVID-19 and how we're in this ridiculous situation because of the market and the capitalist society. We agree, first of all, that the separation of economy and society should take place. It's something that we have acknowledged for a very long time. But we see that the issues with regards to COVID-19 is government regulation. No matter how you see it, government regulation is the cause of all the problems, because in a less regulated society, you have a less targeted response and a less efficient response to the situation at play. When businesses collapse and you lose jobs, you need to get people back into new jobs. And regulation actually slows that down. So we see under a capitalist society, it would actually be much more detrimental. And it'd also be hard to set up for someone who has a business during these times with the high tax rate that we have. So just also taxation of the general working class has proven to be quite difficult on their side of the house. And just briefly with the idea of the environment, we come out on that side very, very easily. We win on the environment with regards to the inefficiency of socialism. We win on the environment with regards to the incentives of private ownership. And we win on the environment with regards to the innovation that we create. At the end of this, let's just reaffirm that we've shown you that at each of the respective clashes on functionality, human creativity, and on the virtues of autonomy, justice, beneficence, and non-maleficence, we not only come out on top, but we thrive. In response to this, the socialists have, and I imagine will continue, to blurt out economically illiterate, unbased, and convoluted emotional sob stories of how their magical fairy dreamland should function, balancing the tightrope between pathetic incompetence and moral corruption. And for these reasons, we're very proud to stand strongly by the assertion that capitalism is indeed better than socialism.
Well, I've always loved being called.
Okay. Annika, I think it's time to move to questions now.
I thought we were doing.
Oh, I can't hear you. Hold on, sorry.
Sorry, Gideon, we've still got one more rebuttal to go.
Oh, we do have one rebuttal. Sorry, Annika, over to you. I do apologise.
Yeah, we will claim our right to rebut the arguments.
Your sovereign right. Here, property rights.
Okay.
Big supporter.
I'm just going to mute you now. So I think that I always love being called a racist by someone who supports the Australian Liberal Party, a party that has supported locking up of refugees and asylum seekers and God knows what else. So I think that we can hear from our final speaker before we get on to the questions, Luca Tavan. And Luca, take it away.
Great. Wow. Well, I'm really thrilled about the way that tonight's gone. I feel like I've really got my money's worth. I've been schooled not just in capitalist economics, but also Trotskyism and the politics of world revolution as well. It really, for me, affirmed your complete lack of interest in history, how society works, interrogating the state of the world and thinking about how we can change it. But you guys gave it a really good attempt, so congratulations. I think the first thing that needs to be commented on is the fact that you've had about, 30 minutes to speak now collectively as defenders of capitalism, and neither of you have been able to give a good 10 seconds on how you respond to the two fundamental crises that are facing the world today. Outside of the economic questions, that's the climate crisis and a global pandemic that's killed more than 1 million people. So on the question of COVID, you haven't said what is the argument from the standpoint of the capitalist system for dealing with a pandemic that is spreading like wildfire throughout the globe and killing people by the thousands every single day. I think the IPA's opposition to the lockdown is really representative of their moral hypocrisy. You talk about it in terms of your concern with freedom and the erosion of civil liberties and freedoms that's going on across the world. Really all you care about is the fact that businesses aren't making money right now. Right now in Sydney, it has to be commented on, there's a real campaign going on to defend freedom, which is being led by my comrades who are fighting pretty heroically to defend the right to protest, which has been completely eradicated by the Liberal government that your organisation supports. But I don't think any members of the IPA have been out there on the streets of Sydney getting arrested, braving fines and police repression to defend that freedom. Every single serious epidemiologist says that if no social distancing and measures or lockdowns of businesses had been implemented in Europe, millions more people would have died at this point than have died. So that's a policy that the IPA is actively for. On the question of the climate crisis, everybody knows this now. People in high school know this. You guys should grasp it. 71% of all carbon emissions in the world are the result of 100 big corporations. If you don't have a program for expropriating those corporations, for forcibly taking their wealth off them, for disciplining them, for controlling their activities, then you have no response to the climate crisis, and the market does not have a response. So if we don't kill capitalism pretty soon, there's a pretty good chance that it's going to kill all of us. I wanted to pick up on one phrase that the last speaker used, because I quite liked it actually, which was malicious and destructive rebellion. I think there is a bit of malicious and destructive rebellion in the politics of socialism, I agree. One example I really liked from quite recently was in about August, I saw there was a protest during the Black Lives Matter movement where protesters set up a guillotine outside the mansion of Jeff Bezos. I thought that was pretty inspiring. There was a report that came out this year that said that the world is now in levels of inequality not seen since the French Revolution. So the kind of imagery of the guillotine coming back is pretty fitting, I think. So there's definitely a fair bit of malice in the rebellion that socialists encourage across the world. We do hate the people that run society, and we do want to see them destroyed. But that rebellion is not just destructive, it's also constructive. Let's look at the balance sheet of what socialists have fought for through history, and let's look at who's opposed them. So what have socialists fought for? Socialists fought for, in this country, the first in the world, and won the 8-hour day. Socialists won a socialised healthcare system, which has allowed people to put, at least to some extent, their health before profit. Socialists fought apartheid in South Africa, opposed by the people exactly like you guys on the other side that say you care about liberty and freedom, who defended that regime until its dying days. Socialists fought against the Vietnam War in the 1970s. We fought against the Iraq War in the 2000s. Is there anyone now on any of those questions, the 8-hour day, apartheid in South Africa, the Vietnam War, that would now, with the benefit of hindsight, defend the position that conservatives took on those questions? No, socialists are always on the right side of history because our politics are based on one very simple but fundamental and important thing. We recognise there's a divide in society between a tiny parasitic layer, as Priya put it, who exploit the vast majority, and us, the people who have the power and the interests to make a new society, not just one where we get to see a share in the wealth that we create, but where we fight against all the different forms of division, oppression, war and violence that capitalist society throws at us every day. So yeah, socialist rebellion is not just destructive, it's constructive as well. It's produced every single thing that we've seen in the world today that makes it worth living in. But I have to say, with the world in the state of crisis and chaos that it currently is, we've actually got a long way to go, and there are going to be a lot of battles ahead. They're battles that I really look forward to as a socialist. In my fairly short time of just a few years as a socialist, I've already been able to do things like help win same-sex marriage in Australia, defeat the introduction of $100,000 university degrees, defeat racist immigration bills that would have seen people checking the passports of immigrants on the streets of Melbourne. We've fought against fascists in the streets of Coburg who wanted to normalise far-right Islamophobic politics. Those are the politics of socialism. It's actually putting your ideas into practice and saying, I'm going to take a side on this big divide and this big battle that's going on in humanity. I'm going to fight and organise around it. And I'm going to look to the future where we can win, because a socialist society based on mass democracy is the only way we're going to save the world from the catastrophe that we're headed into today. And I really implore anyone who's listening to this, if that sounds like the kind of thing you're into, to join us in doing exactly that.
Wonderful. Well, thank you to Luca and our speakers, but we aren't just finished yet. So what I'll do is I'll let people in the comments of the live stream determine who they think won the debate. We'll have a bit of a poll going on, but also we've fielded some questions as well to ask of our speakers because I feel like, yeah, we haven't finished investigating whether or not capitalism can hold up to the arguments of the other side. And I think that there's more the socialists could argue as well. So I'm going to ask a question of the speakers from Generation Liberty, the Institute of Public Affairs, and then Gideon will ask one of the Socialist Alternative speakers, and then back to me, and then back to Gideon. So we will finish with that. So my first question to the speakers for Generation Liberty is, one of the arguments that often is made about the capitalist system is that it's a meritocracy. You know, the people who work the hardest, whatever, will get to the top. But we're currently in a situation where two bigoted old men who you wonder if they're really going to be able to last any longer are now competing for the presidency of the United States. Doesn't this prove what counts in your system that you want to defend is connections and wealth, and not talent or contributions to society? And our speakers will get 2 minutes to respond.
Thanks very much for that. That is a good question, whether or not capitalism is a meritocracy. I just find it very interesting that you prefaced your question, or in your question, you loaded it with two white men who are going at each other for the United States. Now, what you've done there is a very common conflation, nonetheless, but it is a conflation. It is a conflation of politics and the economy. And I'd like to bring that back to Luca as well, because he went on a very, very, very arousing mission statement for his last rebuttal. I really felt like I wanted to go out and fight there for my rights. But that was all about the socialist movement. There was still no defense about the economy. If I was holding my breath waiting for a response about my knowledge argument, I would have died about 20 minutes ago. Now, coming back to the question, politics versus capitalism. Now, that's the thing. What you're talking about is in the political realm. Capitalism is an economic system, and it depends on what you define as the success story, the merit. What is it that people are going for, right? In politics, yes, politics can be construed, but that's politics. That's not capitalism. That is, you might have a problem with the current democratic process in America. That's not capitalism. So to use that as an example of the failure of capitalism, just like using COVID being the failure of capitalism, is utter rubbish. So I think I'll leave it there because you're conflating two very different things.
Thank you, Luca. Now, over to the Socialist Alternative. Our question is, how do you solve the economic calculation problem without a price signal, without the free market, and without, frankly, the profit motive? How do you solve the question of the allocation of goods and services in society and who gets what?
Do I answer this?
I'm happy to take it. Do you want it, Priya?
Either or. I can do it, Luca.
Go for it.
Okay. All right. Thanks for the question, Gideon. So I think that yes, well, look, basically, firstly, you have to say that, yep, capitalist production is not organized in a way that is rational at all, because it's basically, bosses sit in a room and randomly choose to invest in things on the hope that someone might buy it in the future. So it's not like people sit down and plan how many, houses do we need? How much food do we need? How much steel do we need to make buildings or whatever? They randomly produce and hope that there will be a buyer, which is why you have constant crises in capitalism, of overproduction, underproduction, and enormous levels of debt and so on, because it is crazy, competitive, anarchic, and unplanned. So how would that be solved? Basically, eliminate competition from the market, and in so doing, you'll also eliminate the irrationality of the market. Working class people who actually do perform all labor in society would have an idea of what is actually needed to sustain a society. So workers would know, for example, just take something really simple like the workers at Coles. They would have some kind of sense of how much food is actually bought and how much of it is thrown away. So essentially, if the people who are involved in the labor process and so understand its, intimate operations and also live in society and so have a sense of what is actually required for people to sustain themselves, then and people who actually do the labor could discuss, debate themselves, debate with workers across society. I think you could have a world where you don't have massive wastage, massive overproduction and shortages in places where things are actually necessary. So I think that's the answer to that question.
Great, thanks, Priya, for that response. Okay, well, for the last question that I'm going to ask the Generation Liberty speakers, I wonder how you can maintain that capitalism is a rational way of organising human society when our existence as a species is under threat from climate change. Everyone acknowledges we need to end fossil fuel production, and yet a small number of CEOs of major fossil fuel companies are actually planning on expanding oil and gas production. So how is this rational?
Well, thank you so much for your question, Annika. I'd also just quickly like to note, I'd like to thank Vishnupriya as well. She started using her inside voice when she started to think But that being said, she actually didn't answer the question previously given to her. But let me just address this point on environment. Look, I think we made it quite clear today that it's our side of the house which comes on top with the environment. We talk very clearly about the inefficiency of socialism, in that in a capitalist system, we look much better after our waste, because having waste in itself is wasteful for a capitalist society, right? We need to make sure that we use up as many of the resources that we have as possible in the best means possible for the people. So we win on the idea of inefficiency because you don't have that same necessary structure in place in socialism. Also, I think what the opposition doesn't understand is the idea of private ownership. Because with private ownership, there's something called an incentive to protect what you own. I care for the life of my phone. I love my phone, right? I do not want it to be destroyed or whatever, right? Same with my ownership. If you start to own land, if you own a beachside property in Brighton, for God's sake, if I own a beachside property in Brighton, I have every incentive to make sure that the bloody sea level doesn't rise so that it consumes my house, right? I mean, come on, what are these arguments raised by the opposition? And also, they brought up this ridiculous idea as well about how we can't possibly innovate, right? And when what we're seeing at the moment is that with the technologies that the opposition is advocating for, they're advocating for the use of solar panels, for wind turbines, for whatever kind of aqueducts. I mean, come on, how do you think they actually started? They were created, they were formed by good capitalist men, good capitalist, freedom-loving, democracy-loving humans, women, of course, as well. I mean, if you want, whichever side of the house you please, what you have to understand is at the end of the day, the very stuff that the socialists want to use to protect the environment is created from capitalists due to the capitalist incentives by great people, great freedom-loving people. And at the end of this debate, what we see is that they've pretty much tossed the debate today. They don't understand what's going on. They haven't presented a model which actually is effective. And for those reasons, we're very proud to stand by capitalism. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Pumika. I'll get to our final question in a second. This might be my last time to speak tonight. So can I just say how much fun I've had? I know I've had a few jobs, but one thing I've always loved about the Socialist Alternative is that they never back away from a fight. So thank you so much for taking us on, for participating tonight. It's always great to get into a bit of robust debate. So my question to the Socialist Alternative, the final question tonight is, can you explain how a socialist society is possible? Can you defy the law of gravity we have learned throughout human history and explain to us how a socialist society is feasible without centralised power and the loss of individual freedoms?
Great. Yeah, thanks, Gideon. I read on the Generational Liberty website that it was a youth organisation, so you might want to think about moving on to a new career soon, probably pushing it a little bit. I know I don't have much time, but I just thought it was worth commenting on how you guys don't do such a good job when you're having to kind of operate off the cuff. So, you might want to hone your arguments a little bit for next time. I can talk about that quite easily, actually, how a social society is possible and how it would work. Because right now we actually live in a society where production to a very great extent is already socialised. The problem with the way that society is organised right now is that we have socialised production, i.e. production is carried out all across the world through a huge network of collective labour, from the factories like Foxconn in China that assembles iPhones where 300,000 people work collaboratively in close quarters, to the entire chains and networks of production that allow things like cars, microchips, everything that we kind of utilise to be assembled. The problem is that we right now have a parasitic layer who coordinates that whole process of planned production in the interest of maximising their profit and control the entire process. So the basic thing is we already have, to a very large extent, a planned economy. The idea that McDonald's, for instance, delivers cheeseburgers to hundreds of thousands of locations across the world by people going out into marketplaces and buying the ingredients for the cheeseburgers every day, taking them into the restaurant, assembling them and trying to sell them. That's not how capitalism works. It's a highly planned system, and we already have all the technological means to coordinate production on a mass scale. The question of how we're going to get there, well, we're going to need to challenge capitalism and the states that uphold it all across the world, because capitalism is the system that right now is depriving people of liberty. I think the thing that we can look to as socialists to be hopeful, though, is the fact that capitalism actually makes resistance inevitable. Every single decade, every generation, there's been convulsive struggle that's been driven by the injustices of the system, from widening inequality to human rights abuses to state violence. We're living through one right now. There's been a wave of revolutions in the last 12 months all across the world. None of them have overthrown capitalism yet, but they've started to open the door to the argument that there's an alternative to the system that we live under, and started empowering workers, students, oppressed people all across the globe to start taking all sorts of avenues of their lives under their own democratic control. So I look forward to seeing those things unfold over the next couple of decades. Hopefully we do win and create a socialist society rather than see the current one we live under destroy everything on the planet.
Wonderful. Well, thanks everybody to a really interesting evening, a political discussion about the horrors of the world that we live in and the struggle that we'll need to get rid of it. At least that was the argument from the socialist side. Now, we want to host as many debates like this as possible, and people should follow Socialist Alternative Red Flag in order to get updates about future events and the things that we're organising, as well as right now, for all lefties, socialists, anti-capitalists, people who want to take on the system, we're going to have Zoom discussions done by a state level, and you can find the information for those Zooms in the live stream chat or in the Facebook page for this event. Now, I don't know about all of you, but I've been reinvigorated this evening for a fight to take up take on the capitalist system, bring down all of the horrors of our society, fight for a different type of world where people can actually make decisions about their own lives, and fight for a true liberation, a liberation of getting rid of the capitalist system, not to defend it.